Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Carl Rhodes. Carl is a professor of organization studies and dean at the University of Technology Sydney Business School in Sydney, Australia. His research investigates ethical political dimensions of organizations and working life, with a special focus on justice, equity, resistance, dissent, and democracy. And today we will speak about his latest book, Woke Capitalism: How Corporate Morality is Sabotaging Democracy. Carl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Alain, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So as I was telling you a minute ago, I feel such a great privilege that we are having this conversation, me in Quebec, Canada, and you in Sydney, Australia, two ancient territories of England. So we are united by this common language. And, I became a Canadian citizen not too long ago, and I had to pledge my allegiance to the Queen of England. I don't know how that happens, but I had to swear my allegiance to the Queen. So we're still living in the time of the English imperialism.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I was actually born in Britain and I moved to Australia as a young man and became an Australian citizen, and also had to repledge a similar sort of allegiance. So that's something that we have in common. But the fact that we are talking across the world in this way really is a symptom of where globalization and technology has come. I remember as a child, if you wanted to make an overseas phone call, you would have to, not a child, even as a young person, that's something you would have to save up for because it was so prohibitively expensive. So things really have changed, enabling this kind of exchange, which is really great.
So, Carl, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background, and especially how is it that you became a professor in Australia? What is your professional background?
Well, I initially went to university in the UK and did a degree in economics. And after that, I moved to Australia. Um, just kind of a bit of a exploration, really. But I eventually settled here, and I started work in the corporate world. But soon realized that my real passion and my vocation was academic work, scholarship, and education, and moved into the university sector. Did a doctoral degree in business and education, and really kind of went from there. My interest's always been in the effects of corporations on the world, whether that be in terms of people's working lives as employees, or but also more generally in terms of relationship with society. I work in kind of management and organization studies and business ethics, and really interested more generally in how the expansion of corporate power, as it's happened in the neoliberal era since the 1980s, means that corporations have increasingly greater influence on our lives, and a greater influence also on politics, not always for the better. So exploring that and trying to bring some new light to those things is kind of what my research has been focused on over the past years.
When I was about 18 years old, I took a business ethics class, and I was under the impression that all corporations in the world were operating according to the guidelines of Milton Friedman, which was to make as much money as possible. That's how I understood it at the time. And then when I took this business ethics class, I found out that there were other constituents and there were other players in the game, and the game had to be fair or as much as possible to everybody else. But so that was a big moment for me to realize that corporations, this whole purpose is not just to make as much money for the shareholder. So I wonder, why is it that you dedicated part of your life to fight for equality, decent democracy. I mean, many economists, they try to focus on how efficient the market could be, and maybe it's related, but can you share why you went this way?
Well, I think, I mean, if you follow Friedman's kind of edict, which he wrote in the 60s and then became a bit more popular with his New York Times article in the 1970s, the idea that business should just pursue the interests of shareholders. This is something that became particularly popular from the 80s and 90s with the notion of shareholder primacy and kind of political changes brought in by Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and the globalization of this really started looking at corporations more and more to provide the kind of enterprise that they felt was required for the development of the global economy. And bearing in mind, this was at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and the fall of the former Soviet Union. And there was this very much kind of enamored, and Milton Friedman was an advisor to these governments. But I think as this played out, and there was a promise of what at the time some people called trickle-down economics, that if we kind of liberate the wealth of corporations and elite wealthy people, that would kind of trickle down to everyone else. And I think what we've realized, this experiment has failed, and wealth hasn't trickled down. Inequalities are widening on a global scale. Often those inequalities are exacerbated both on a gendered and racial basis, as well as on a differences between countries. We get chief executives earning massively excessive pay, which is increasing and increasing and increasing. So in effect, the pursuit of this Friedman's ideal, if you like, has actually, not produced equal results. And there's a sense of injustice in this that needs to be criticized and reformed. And I guess my work will never achieve that as a single person, but is contributing to that larger goal, where we need to not just remember the economic promise, but also the democratic promise of freedom and equality. And I think there's been so much focus on freedom, equality has suffered as a result.
But I don't want to be sarcastic, but where in that promise is equality? I mean, isn't the whole objective of capitalism is to make the owners of the capital richer?
No, absolutely it is. But I think what we have to look at here is that if we look at societies and nations like Canada, like Australia, which operate in the nexus of liberal democracy and market capitalism, it's the relationship between these. And to an extent, there's a tension between these in which liberal democracies operate. So on the one hand, while capitalism in its root is set up to produce surplus for the owners of capital, should that be just left to go rampant? Because if it does, you just get monopolies and big corporations with excessive power dominating the world in many ways. We see it, if you look at big corporations like Facebook and Apple and Amazon, extraordinary power over the world. And in a sense, liberal democracy has shifted in a sense that it's no longer balancing out that power with the power of popular sovereignty, the power of democracy, where the sovereignty of a nation lies with the people. And there's a danger that the growth in economic power of corporation comes to threaten the sovereign power of democracy, and that the necessary tension between capitalism and democracy is kind of being lost, and the private interests then come to take over the public interests. And so I would argue that we need a resurgence of focus on public interest and a new kind of vision for politics in terms of what that means for shared prosperity, not just prosperity for the people, for the elite who are involved in benefiting from corporate wealth.
So I understand that you are advocating for guardrails for capitalism. I mean, because the idea of capitalism, some people say that it's the less bad system out there nobody else have come up with a less bad system other than capitalism, but you are advocating to, yes, okay, this is the system that we have, but we need to put some guardrails in order to spread the wealth more evenly among the constituents.
Exactly. I'm not arguing against capitalism per se. Not at all. I think, you know, the benefits of markets, the benefits of enterprise, the innovation that comes from capitalism are all, you know, great things that you know, that have benefited the development of the world. I mean, they've also done other things like, you know, produced pollution and climate change and negatively. So it's not, I'm not saying it's all good. But I'm not advocating against capitalism. But yeah, guardrails, as you say, but to set some limits, and to set the limits that corporations, of course, exist by law. They are incorporated through a legal system. So they are at a level subservient to the law. And the law, you know, and being a central institution of democracy, is what is superordinate. But this doesn't seem to be how it plays out. Corporations, especially now multinational corporations, you can just move around different jurisdictions. You know, I mean, corporate tax avoidance is a classic example of this. I mean, you talked before about your business ethics class and recognizing more constituents, which many businesses do, and there's people now talk about stakeholder capitalism and so forth. But the biggest contribution that corporations will ever make to a society is paying taxes that can then be used for schools and roads and hospitals and welfare for people who need it. But the massive, you know, corporations treat tax like a cost and try to minimize it. Big corporations, often through very complex systems. So again, we see a situation like, who's in charge in a democratic society? Should it be the representatives of the people, or should it be the representatives of wealth? In my view, it should be the representatives of the people, but we're moving further and further away from that ideal as corporate power expands.
Right. So just one more critique on that idea. What happened when the representative of the people is someone like Donald Trump, or right now like Vladimir Putin, who really don't seem to be representing their people at all?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is a classic example, and I think making the comparison with him and Putin is a reasonable one. And in fact, you'll remember when Donald Trump was president, he made many favorable comments about Putin at the time. I mean, given what's been happening, terrible things happening in Europe, in the Ukraine in the last weeks, that's interesting to reflect on. But the thing is, it might be the case that you get a leader of this nature. But I think we have to understand that there's much more to democracy than an elected president or an elected prime minister. It's the institutions of democracy, you know, the government institutions, the judiciary, even the free press that is allowed to exist. The advantage of democracy as a system isn't that it's perfect, isn't that it's not going to produce people like Donald Trump, you know, but it's that it's always correctable. And Trump got elected out. And that Putin, not in a democratic system, can't get elected out in the same way. And I think that's the difference between you know, one of the main differences between an autocratic system and a democratic one is that it's always correctable and changeable. Not that it's perfect. I mean, democracy never has been perfect. Democracy is always a promise that we have to continue to try and live up to every day, not something that's achieved. I think of it a bit like the horizon. You know, if you look at the horizon and you walk towards the horizon, you never reach it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try and walk there. And democracy works a bit like that.
Okay, well, tell us about this book, Woke Capitalism. What is it what is it about? What was your inspiration to write it?
The inspiration to write this book was the observation that in the late 2010s, many corporations increasingly started to support political positions that would have traditionally been associated with progressive politics or even left-wing politics. So where we might think of corporations as being, capitalist organizations, suddenly there was CEOs and billionaires were publicly and financially supporting these kind of political causes. I mean, key examples would be the Me Too movement, and you might recall Gillette's advertising campaign as one example of kind of combat of drawing attention to toxic masculinity, the Black Lives Matter movement, and what happened in the United States with Colin Kaepernick and the NFL. But also even Pepsi brought Black Lives Matter into its advertising, seemingly to think that drinking Pepsi would solve endemic racial problems in the US, which is kind of ludicrous. Corporations supporting same-sex marriage, climate activism being a big one, animal rights. So what would have once been seen quite divisive political positions, corporations suddenly taking overt positions on this. Now, what I also found is that many of the people criticizing this were criticizing it because they were similar to Milton Friedman, who you said talked about before. They were saying, no, businesses shouldn't be involved in this political stuff, just get on with being capitalists. But my view was that by connecting to these political positions, usually after they'd already been settled, the real activists had done the hard work before the corporations come in. It was actually further strengthening the power of corporations in a kind of negative way, by kind of trying to kind of moralize them and associate them with particular views. And so the book really explores the history of that and how it happened, and why woke capitalism isn't a problem because of the wokeness, which is what many people criticize. It's a problem because of the way that it changes capitalism, and how capitalism increasingly encroaching on personal and moral life of people rather than restricting itself to economic life.
And to what extent is the corporations making this decision themselves or being pushed by the stakeholders? Like we have the case now with Disney, who decided to stay out of the controversy of, say, gay problem or controversy that they're having in Florida. So their first reaction was to say or do nothing. And then they had the consumers, the employees revolting against the corporation to the point that Disney had to say, oh, we stand against this bill. So to what point is the corporation saying, okay, we are going to ride this wave to our advantage, or are they being pushed by the employees and their clients?
I think it's probably both, because I think that corporations are under pressure, both from customers, clients, and shareholders in many cases, and fear of boycott and fear of losing business. And so in effect, in doing that, even though they might position themselves in a positive way, it's still a business decision on their part. So I think ultimately it's a business decision. A good example, if you think of companies like McDonald's and Coca-Cola withdrawing from Russia, they were some of the later companies to withdraw from Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. And again, it was in response, there was the hashtag boycott McDonald's was all over. And I think eventually they just realized that if they stayed in Russia, a very small percentage of their business, then it would affect their sales more broadly in Europe and the United States in particular. And therefore, it was a very commercial decision to withdraw from Russia. However, if you read their press releases, it's all because of being in Russia didn't align with their values. So I think, and it's probably true, because their values are probably about maximizing their revenues. So you have this kind of moralization going on, but the decisions are really business decisions. And so I think there is increasing pressure from the public, and that businesses respond. I mean, that is a good thing in some ways. But it can shift very quickly as well. It's a very disorganized kind of politics where it's just where, pressures of public opinion dictate corporate decisions. But in the end, I think these corporations, whether it be Disney or McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Shell or whoever it might be, they are ultimately commercial decisions dressed up in moral terms.
Okay, and just until now, you had spoken about corporations themselves, but on chapter A, you speak about the CEO activist. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think I mean, you see corporations in general taking these stands, but increasingly we see CEOs as particular individuals coming out and also taking particular positions. And the idea, many people saying that CEOs should do this. So it's not just corporate activism in the terms of general decisions, or much of woke capitalism comes in the form of advertising and alignment. But actual CEOs are now expected to have views on political positions. And again, this reflects the increasing power of individual CEOs, that people care what they think about politics, where in the past, no one cared what, the head of General Motors or whoever it would have been cared about particular political views. But now it is. And related to this as well, you get the idea of CEOs becoming politicians. Donald Trump is a classic example of someone whose work was in as the head of the corporation, who became a politician. Back in the day, Berlusconi in Italy was also a former businessman. So you see that there's this CEOs increasingly getting involved in public life and making these kind of statements and being expected to. And again, the classic distinction in democracy is between the private sphere of business and the economy and the public sphere of politics and people. And the idea is that these are kept apart, and that they're kept up quite deliberately as a core feature of the connection between liberal democracy and free market economics in capitalism in contemporary world. But again, there becomes a kind of blurring of the boundaries between these two, and that really disrupts some of the more fundamental elements of democracy itself.
Okay, so that's the trend. There's corporations and CEO who being involved in social issues to their advantage. What do you see as the future? What's going to happen 10, 20 years from now?
That is a big question that I cannot answer directly. I think what's happened, I think that, my generation, I was born in the late 1960s. We've witnessed this change. We've witnessed this change, particularly since the 1980s. The growth of corporations, the deregulation of corporations, the privatization of one's public organizations, and this move, this significant shift in the way that capitalism operates, in a way that's benefiting the few and not the many. And we're kind of still stuck in this, I think. And I must say, my generation has failed to address this. So I think what we really need in the next 20 years is there needs to emerge a new generation of people with a new political imagination. And we see it, when school kids go to the street to protest climate change, led by a teenager, Greta Thunberg, we see an example. And even if you look at the kind of corporate response to climate change that we see now, where finally, after in many cases so many years of climate change denial, corporations are starting to get serious about doing something, that's not because of their leadership, it's because of the leadership, grassroots leadership that comes from people. And I mean, and the movement, the climate movement that Thunberg initiated is certainly part of that. So I think and if I see, I work in a university, I meet young people coming out of school and starting university education. And I think there is a renewed concern for society, a renewed concern for the environment that previous generations didn't have. So I can't predict what will happen in the next 20 years, but I think I would really support, a new political imagination emerging from the next generation in a way, as I said, that I hate to admit it, but my generation has failed to do.
Well, in this age where corporation can set up digitally anywhere in the world, I assume that the idea of a global tax is a step in the right direction. So corporations, no matter where they are, even if they are in a tax zero country, they will still have this minimum tax that they have to pay to the world, not necessarily to a particular country, but to the world in general.
Look, I mean, if a global agreement around such a tax was available, I think that would certainly be very positive, because at present, as I said before, we have massive tax avoidance programs, and we have so-called, tax shopping, where companies will set up. I'll give you an example. I recently bought a pair of shoes from a global sports shoe manufacturer. I won't tell you the name of the company. And I'm here in Australia, and I bought these shoes actually for my son. And I got the shoes were made, I think, in China. They were distributed from Singapore. They were purchased by me in Australia. And when I got my credit card statement, it was billed in Ireland, because that's where the low taxes are. That's the kind of stuff that we see. The very complex. This is the complex issues of globalization that allow these things to happen. So this company, I buy these shoes. It's a big brand name, but it's clear they're not even hiding this. It appears on my credit card statement that this is billed in Ireland, a country that had nothing to do with any of the transactions. It wasn't where they were bought, it wasn't where they were made, it wasn't where they were distributed, it's where the tax wasn't paid. And and so it's all fine to talk about, nice sounding woke ideals from corporations who are quite happy to talk about, social issues. But when corporations talk out in politics, they very rarely talk about economic issues. It's not about tax. It's not about executive and CEO pay. It's not about inequality. It's not about minimum wage. It's not about universal basic income. Certainly not about trade unionism and workers' rights and solidarity. It's restricted to social issues. And by restricting the discussion to social issues, that distracts attention away from the much more core economic issues that affect people's lives in serious and often detrimental ways.
Many years ago, maybe like 10 years ago, I used to be an Airbnb host. And my paycheck from Airbnb came from Netherlands. And there were suggestions of different banks globally where they could deposit my check. And I mean, they wouldn't have to share that information with the Canadian government. So there we go.
Yeah.
Many ways to kind of avoid paying taxes. But the idea of a global tax, if countries can get together one way or another, is a step in the right direction, because we all need the support of these organizations that are a major infrastructure in our life, but we also need them to pay for schools and transportation and all the secondary effect that they create.
And I think too, there's been a lot of talk over many decades now about kind of small government and deregulation, this whole kind of small government movement. But if you look at recent events, look at what's happened with COVID. No nation would have managed through COVID well without massive government intervention, involving corporations as well, but whether it be the creation of vaccines, the distribution of vaccines, the use of fiscal policy to manage, the economy at a time of lockdown, the support for people who are out of work. This all required government. Without government, COVID would have been even worse of a disaster than it has been. And in a sense, there was a kind of return of government during COVID, and a return of the idea of the necessity of government. If you look at the war in Ukraine, again, the necessities of government in relation to maintaining some kind of world order and the hope of world peace. Corporations can't do these things. So it is also then a question of rethinking the role of private and public organizations in creating a fair and peaceful society. And that is, much of what needs rethinking, I believe. And my book, if anything, it's probably a lot better at pointing out the problems than providing the solutions. I will, I'm happy to admit this, but also we need to be aware of what's going on. And if the book makes some small contribution to raising that awareness, then I think it would have achieved its goals.
Well, I am enjoying the book very much, especially the first part where you kind of go deep into explaining where the term woke comes from, because I've been hearing it for years now and I never knew where it came from. So
Yeah.
and then how is it that the corporations have jumped into this bandwagon? So my last question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
Okay, the title of the book is Woke Capitalism, How Corporate Morality is Sabotaging Democracy. It's available in the usual places, but the publisher is Bristol University Press, so their website is one place that you can find it. You can follow me on Twitter at Prof. Carl Rhodes, where I often share information about not just my own work, but also other relevant things as well. And of course, share Alain's podcast widely with your friends and acquaintances.
Carl, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely my pleasure. Great to talk to you, Alain.